There is a stretch of Philadelphia road called the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. It runs wide and proud through the heart of the city, past museums and fountains and monuments to American greatness. And on that very parkway, sometime around the year 1959, a 5-year-old boy was deliberately left behind by the only family he had. He did not know where he was. He did not know how to get home. And when a policewoman finally found him and asked him his name, the boy could only answer that he didn't know it. Now hold that picture in your mind, because some 50 years later, in the year 2010, a grown man walked through the doors of the largest men's homeless shelter in that same city of Philadelphia. He was tired. He was broke, and he carried a secret he begged the other men around him to keep. The secret was this: that the man sleeping in that shelter had once been a world champion, a man who had earned, by one respected estimate from Ring magazine, somewhere close to $4 million in the ring, a man boxing fans had once warred for by the thousands. His name, by then, was Matthew Saad Muhammad, and the haunting truth of his life is that the abandoned child on the parkway and the broke man in the shelter were the very same person, beginning and nearly ending in the same square mile of the same unforgiving city. How does that happen? How does a fighter known across America as Miracle Matthew, a man who held a world title for 2.5 years, end up asking strangers in a shelter not to whisper who he used to be? Where did the millions go? Where did the man himself disappear to? That is the mystery we are going to walk through tonight. And to do it honestly, you have to understand that this was a man of 3 names: the name he was born with and never knew, the name a group of nuns invented for him, and the name he finally chose for himself. Each one tells a chapter of how a discarded boy became a champion of the world, and how the world let him fall. But to understand any of it, you have to go back to that parkway, to the moment a small boy was left alone and told nothing at all, not even who he was. He was born in Philadelphia on the 16th of June, 1954. His mother passed away when he was still an infant, before he could ever remember her face. He and an older brother were taken in by an aunt, a woman doing her best in a world that gave her very little to work with. And there came a day when the math of survival turned cruel. The aunt, by his own later account, simply could not afford to raise both boys. So she told the older brother to get rid of the younger one. Years later, after he had become a champion and then lost everything, Matthew Saad Muhammad told this story in his own words. He told it in the pages of a Philadelphia street newspaper called One Step Away, a publication produced by people who had themselves known homelessness. And what he wrote there is almost unbearable in its simplicity. A relative, he said, took him out into the city where he wouldn't know where he was or how to find his way home, and then ran away from him. He was alone on the streets. He was so scared. A policewoman found him, he wrote, and asked him his name, and he told her he didn't know his name. Think about that for a moment. A small child, in the cold early hours, unable to answer the most basic question a person can be asked: who are you? He did not know. He was found asleep on the steps of a church, a tiny figure curled against the stone. And he was taken in by Catholic Social Services, the first institution in a long line of them that would catch this boy after the world had thrown him away. It would not be the last time he was discovered with nothing and rebuilt from scratch. That pattern of being cast aside and then somehow surviving was set before he was old enough for school. The nuns who took him in faced an immediate and strange problem. A child needs a name to exist in the world, for records, for school, for life itself. And this child had none. So the women who sheltered him decided they would give him one. And the name they chose would carry the address of his own abandonment with him for the rest of his days. The nuns named him Matthew, after the saint. And for a surname, they looked to the place where he had been found, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. So they called him Franklin. Matthew Franklin. A name stitched together from a religion and a road. A name that, if you knew the truth behind it, was really a small monument to the very spot where a 5-year-old had been left to disappear. For a while, the boy lived in the care of Catholic social services. And then, at the age of 7, something rare happened in a life that had so far offered him almost nothing. A family stepped forward. He was adopted by John and Bertha Santos, Portuguese immigrants who lived in South Philadelphia. A working-class household, a new neighborhood, a fragile, hard-won second chance at belonging to someone. You have to picture the world he was growing into. This was Philadelphia in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, a poor, working-class, racially divided American city, in an era when the color of a child's skin shaped where he could live, where he could go, and what doors would quietly close in his face. For a black boy who had already been abandoned once, who carried a borrowed name and the memory of a parkway, the lesson came early and it came hard. Survival was not promised to you. You had to take punishment, you had to absorb it, and you had to get back up. That trait, the ability to take a beating and rise anyway, would one day make him famous in arenas across the country. Crowds would scream his name when he climbed off the canvas and came roaring back. They would call it heart. They would call it a miracle. But the truth is, he had been practicing that exact skill since before he could read, getting knocked down by life and refusing to stay down. South Philadelphia gave Matthew Franklin a family and a roof over his head. But it was a boxing gym in that same gritty neighborhood that finally handed him something no one had ever given him before: a way to fight back. He found it in a South Philadelphia boxing gym, and in his own framing, told years later, he didn't just find a sport in that gym. He found his calling. Imagine what that meant for a boy like him. Here was a place where the thing that had defined his whole life, the ability to endure pain and keep moving forward, was not a tragedy, but a talent. Here was a language for his survival instinct, spelled out in leather gloves and the rhythm of a heavy bag. The amateur road that followed was short. By the most reliable account, Matthew Franklin had only about 20 amateur bouts. That is a small number for a future world champion. Most spend years building dozens, even hundreds of amateur fights before turning professional. Now you should know that the records here are not perfectly clean. One account of his life claims a slightly different amateur tally, around 25 fights. We are going to stick with the documented figure of roughly 20 bouts, because that is what the most careful records support. And because part of telling this man's story honestly means admitting where the paper trail gets thin. His whole life was full of gaps like that, of facts that were lost or never written down. It started with a child who didn't even know his own name. But amid those 20-some bouts, there is one shining, documented marker of just how good he already was. In 1973, Matthew Franklin won the Trenton, New Jersey Golden Gloves. That was no small thing. The Golden Gloves were where the country's best young amateurs proved themselves, where future champions were first noticed. He had walked into that competition as a kid from South Philadelphia with a borrowed name and a brutal childhood, and he had walked out a champion. The very next year, he made the leap that would define the rest of his life. He turned professional. And in 1974, when he stepped through the ropes as a paid fighter for the very first time, it took him only about 90 seconds into the second round to give the boxing world its first real glimpse of the man they would soon be calling Miracle Matthew. His professional debut came in 1974, and it ended the way so many of his fights would, with the other man on the canvas. He stopped an opponent named Billy Early by knockout in the second round. It was the start of a remarkable opening run. He won his first 8 professional fights that year before he tasted defeat for the first time, dropping a 6-round decision to a fighter named Wayne McGee. But even in that early stretch, the shape of his career was already visible. He was a finisher, he was exciting, and he was nearly impossible to discourage. The real breakthrough came in 1977. On the national stage, in his first nationally televised fight, Matthew Franklin met a dangerous opponent named Marvin Johnson, a man who would go on to become a 3-time world champion. And in the 12th round, Franklin knocked him out to claim the United States light heavyweight title. For a fighter who had begun life with nothing, this was the night America first learned his name. Millions watching at home saw what the gyms of Philadelphia already knew. And what they saw was a style unlike almost anyone else's. Matthew Franklin was an action fighter, a man who refused to play it safe, who walked forward into danger, who would absorb staggering, frightening punishment, and then, just when it seemed he was finished, storm back and take his opponent apart. Fans adored it. Ringside doctors winced at it. He would get hit with blows that would have ended other men's nights, and somehow he would rise and turn the fight on its head. That is how he earned the nickname that followed him for the rest of his life: Miracle Matthew. The respected Philadelphia boxing promoter J. Russell Peltz, who watched this man's entire career unfold, would later put it as plainly as anyone could. Saad Muhammad, he said, was probably one of the most entertaining fighters who ever lived. And the men he fought and beat, Peltz insisted, were operating at the very highest level of their time. By 1978, this discarded boy from the Parkway was beating the best in the world. But one savage, unforgettable night against a relentless Mexican warrior named Yaqui López was about to reveal just how much punishment Matthew Franklin could swallow and still find a way to win. 1978 was the year the boxing world stopped wondering about Matthew Franklin and started fearing him. He fought 4 times that year, and he won all 4. But it was not the wins themselves that mattered. It was how he won them. Twice that year, he defended a title against men who had stood at the very top of the light heavyweight division. First came Richie Cates, a former world title challenger, a serious and dangerous fighter. Franklin handled him. And then came the name that would be tied to his forever: Yaqui López. López was a Mexican warrior, a 4-time world title challenger, a man with no quit in him and stone in both fists. The two of them met that year for the first time, and what unfolded between the ropes was the kind of fight that old boxing men still talk about with a kind of reverence in their voices. It was war. López came at him in waves, throwing everything he had, and for stretches of that fight, it looked as though Matthew Franklin might finally have met the punishment he could not survive. But that was the thing about this man. The deeper he was dragged into trouble, the more dangerous he seemed to become. He weathered the storm, found his moment, and stopped López by knockout in the 11th round. Experts who saw it called it a classic on the spot. And here is where you begin to understand the legend of Miracle Matthew in full. Picture the scene that became his signature. Cuts opening above both of his eyes, blood running down his face, into his vision, painting the canvas beneath his feet. A lesser fighter folds in that situation. The corner stops it. The crowd groans and goes home. But not this man. The worse the punishment, the more thrilling his comeback became. And one of those bloody, desperate, magnificent rounds was so dramatic that it earned the highest honor a single round of boxing can receive. The Ring magazine named it the Round of the Year. To understand why crowds loved him the way they did, you have to remember the world he was fighting in. This was the late 1970s, and according to the men who lived it, this was the single greatest era in the history of the light heavyweight division, a golden stretch that ran roughly from 1975 to 1983. Promoter J. Russell Peltz said so himself. The fights were brutal, they were televised, and they were built for the fans. This was boxing, as so many Americans of a certain generation remember it. Two men, no excuses, everything on the line on a Saturday afternoon. He had conquered the United States. He had survived Lopez once. But on the 22nd of April, 1979, Matthew Franklin would walk into Marvin Johnson's own hometown to take something he had never held in his hands before, a championship of the whole world. Marvin Johnson was not a man who lost easily, and he certainly was not a man who lost easily in front of his own people. So when the chance came for the vacant WBC World Light Heavyweight crown, the fight was set for Indianapolis, Johnson's hometown, his crowd, his roar. For most challengers, walking into that environment is a disadvantage that breaks them before the opening bell. For a man who had spent his entire life being unwanted in unfamiliar places, it was simply Tuesday. The fight itself became one of the defining performances of his career, a bout so good it would later be replayed on ESPN's classic fights for new generations who never saw it live. And it followed the pattern that by now you can almost predict. There was danger, there was drama, and then there was the storm. Late in the seventh round, Matthew Franklin staggered Marvin Johnson, and the hometown crowd felt the ground shift beneath their hero. In the eighth round, he finished the job. Knockout. The vacant world title was his. That eighth round was so extraordinary that for the second year running, the Ring magazine named it the Round of the Year, this time for 1979. And the honors did not stop with the moment. Years later, in 1996, when boxing historians sat down to rank the greatest title fights the sport had ever produced, the second meeting between these two men would be placed 35th on that all-time list. That is how long this performance lived. That is how deeply it carved itself into the memory of the sport. Now stop and let the full weight of this settle over you. The boy who was left on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway with no name. The child who told a policewoman he did not know who he was. The kid handed a surname by nuns because he had none of his own. That boy was now, by the highest sanction the sport could offer, the champion of the world. Not the champion of Philadelphia, not the champion of America, the champion of the entire world. It should have been the happiest ending a man could write. But here is the strange and beautiful twist that came next. Within months of making that name famous across the globe, he would walk away from it entirely. The name Matthew Franklin, the name printed on the world title, the name the crowds were chanting, he was about to give it up and choose for himself a new one, inspired by the most famous Muslim athlete on the face of the earth. Think for a moment about everything a name had meant in this man's life. He had been born with one he would never remember. He had been given a second by strangers in a church, stitched together from a saint and the road of his own abandonment. Both of his names, the birth name and the borrowed name, had been handed to him by other people. He had never once, in his entire life, chosen who he was. That changed in 1979. Shortly after he won the WBC world title, Matthew Franklin embraced the faith of Islam. And with that conversion, he took a new name, Matthew Saad Muhammad. It was the third name of his life, and it was the only one he ever chose for himself. He was not alone in this. He was part of a remarkable wave of light heavyweight champions of that era who converted and took new names. There was Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, born Eddie Gregory. There was Dwight Muhammad Qawi, born Dwight Braxton, a name to remember because that man's path and his own were destined to collide. And towering over all of them as inspiration stood the most famous athlete in the world, the man whose courage to change his own name had echoed across America. Saad Muhammad said plainly that he had been inspired by the example of Muhammad Ali. But for him, the meaning ran deeper than it did for almost anyone. For most men, changing your name is an act of faith. For this man, it was something more. It was the first time in his life that he held a pen over the question of his own identity and wrote the answer himself. The discarded child who could not tell a policewoman his name had grown into a world champion who looked at the names other people had assigned him and said, "No, I will decide who I am." There is a quiet power in that, a kind of triumph that has nothing to do with boxing at all. And now, fighting under the name he had chosen, standing as champion of the world, he entered the most dominant and dramatic stretch of his entire career. 8 title defenses, a voided decision that should never have been voided, a scandal involving a forbidden substance, not in his own body, but in his own corner, and the bloodiest war of his violent, miraculous life. The reign of Matthew Saad Muhammad as world champion was everything his rise had promised, relentless, dramatic, and never, ever boring. He would defend the WBC World Light Heavyweight title 8 times in total, but 2 of those defenses tell you more about the man and about the strange currents of his career than all the others combined. The first came against John Conte, a former world champion and a proud, skilled fighter. They met in Atlantic City, and over 15 grueling rounds, Saad Muhammad earned the decision and kept his crown. It should have been clean. It was not. After the fight, officials determined that his cornerman had used a prohibited substance to stop the bleeding from one of his cuts. That old enemy, the cuts above his eyes, following him even into his championship reign. The result was voided. The victory was erased from the books, and a rematch was ordered. Now, you might wonder how a man reacts when a hard-won title defense is wiped away over something his corner did. Matthew Saad Muhammad reacted the only way he knew how. In the rematch, he removed all doubt and all judges from the equation entirely. He knocked Conte out in the 4th round. And then there was the rematch the whole sport had been waiting for. Yaqui López, the warrior he had stopped once before, came again in 1980. What followed is remembered by many as one of the most savage and heroic fights ever staged in that division. In the 8th round, López unloaded on him. By one accounting, somewhere around 20 unanswered blows landed on the champion as he stood trapped against the ropes. 20 punches, clean, with no reply. There is no fighter alive who survives that and stays a champion. And yet, when the smoke cleared, Matthew Saad Muhammad was still standing. Not only standing, he came roaring back, the way he always did. And before it was over, he had dropped Yaqui López to the canvas 5 separate times. He won by knockout in the 14th round. The Ring magazine named it the Fight of the Year for 1980, and the champion himself, a man who had been hit harder and more often than almost anyone in the sport, said of that night simply, "This was my toughest fight." That was the summit. That was the absolute peak of his powers, with the world at his feet and Hollywood about to come knocking on his door. But the height of a man's life is so often the exact place from which the long fall begins. At the very top of his fame, the movies came calling. Sylvester Stallone, riding the enormous success of his boxing films, was casting the 3rd chapter of the Rocky saga, and he needed a fighter to play the fearsome challenger Clubber Lang. According to accounts drawn from boxing records, Stallone sought out Matthew Saad Muhammad himself for the part. Imagine it, the discarded boy from the Parkway, offered a starring role opposite one of the biggest movie stars in the world. And he turned it down. The reason, in his own words, was almost stubbornly simple. "They wanted me to shave my head," he recalled, "and I refused to do that." That was it. A role that might have carried his name and his face into living rooms for generations, passed over because he would not give up his own hair. There is something painfully telling in that small decision. A man who had finally, after a lifetime of being remade by other people, claimed full authorship over his own image and was not willing to let even Hollywood reshape him. The part, of course, went elsewhere, and that film became a worldwide sensation without him. But behind the fame and the offers, a quieter danger was beginning to gather. Even during his championship reign, Matthew Saad Muhammad had started confronting problem with his vision. For a fighter, the eyes are everything. They are how you see the punch coming, how you find your opening, how you survive. And his eyes, the very same eyes that kept splitting open above the brow fight after bloody fight, were beginning to betray him. It was a slow, creeping thing, easy to ignore while the winds kept coming and the crowds kept roaring. For now, the good years were still holding. He was the champion. He was beloved. He was, by one respected estimate of his career earnings, on his way to making millions of dollars in the ring. The applause was deafening, and the money was flowing in. From the outside, Matthew Saad Muhammad looked untouchable, a man who had beaten the world and beaten his own past and stood at the very center of the golden age of his sport. But on the 19th of December, 1981, a shorter, fiercer, ferociously determined fighter from his own city of Philadelphia was about to climb through the ropes against him. His name was Dwight Muhammad Qawi, and in 10 brutal rounds, he would not only take Matthew Saad Muhammad's title, he would knock loose the only stable thing this restless, wandering man had ever truly possessed. There was a cruel symmetry in the man who took the crown. Dwight Muhammad Qawi had been born Dwight Braxton, and like the champion he was hunting, he had embraced Islam and chosen a new name. He was a Philadelphia fighter, just as the title holder was, shorter, squatter, built low to the ground like a wrecking ball, fighting from a crouch and coming forward without mercy. On the 19th of December, 1981, over 10 relentless rounds, Qawi did what so many great fighters had tried and failed to do. He broke the champion down, stopped him, and took the WBC World Light Heavyweight title. A rematch came in 1982, in the former champion's own city, in front of his own people. It should have been redemption. Instead, it was something worse than the first defeat. Qawi stopped him even sooner, in the 6th round, and the hometown crowd watched their fallen hero fall a second time. The reign was not just over. The man himself was no longer the same fighter. The years that followed grew thin and sad. Through 1982 and into the early 90s, he fought only sporadically, with little of the old success. The body that had absorbed 20 unanswered blows and stood tall was surrendering to time and the slow accumulation of 1,000 punches taken on purpose. Then came the strangest and most painful coda of all. In 1991, he traveled to Japan to compete in an early forerunner of what we now call mixed martial arts. True to the man he had always been, he talked a great deal at the press conference, promising victory. Then the contest began. His opponent, a grappler named Kiyoshi Tamura, took him to the ground and submitted him in 34 seconds. For a man who had once been the most thrilling fighter alive, it was a humiliating end to the fighting part of his life. But the battles he was losing inside the ropes were nothing beside the fight he was losing outside them, the one he didn't even know was already lost. A respected estimate placed his career ring earnings at roughly $4 million. By the standards of his era, that was a genuine fortune, enough to keep a family secure for the rest of their lives, enough to build something permanent at last. So where did it go?
The fighter himself gave an answer, and it is one of the most heartbreaking sentences in this entire story. "I gave a lot of money away," he said. "I had millions of dollars. I had savings. I had a bank account. But people I trusted ran away with my money." There is a whole life buried inside those words. People I trusted. This was a man who had spent his earliest years learning that the people closest to you were exactly the ones who might leave you on an empty road and run. Now, as a wealthy champion, he had handed his trust to others again, and again, that trust had been carried off into the dark. Was it betrayal? Was it pure generosity? A man who had grown up with nothing, suddenly unable to say no to anyone who asked? Was it a soul that had never been taught that anything good was allowed to last, and so spent it all before it could be taken away? Perhaps all three at once. What is certain is that the false friends and the open hands drained him while trouble gathered on every side. His vision continued to fail him, that quiet enemy from his championship days. And in 1986, the collapse arrived in the cold language of the courts. He declared bankruptcy. What the reliable record tells us is stark enough. $4 million had passed through his hands. By the middle of the decade, it was gone, leaving a former champion of the world legally broke. For a man who had been abandoned once with absolutely nothing, losing everything a second time must have carried a terrible, familiar echo. In 2010, the erosion reached the ground floor. He lost his housing. And a man who had been celebrated in arenas, a man who would later be inducted into the highest hall his sport could offer, checked himself into the RHD Ridge Center. At that time, the largest shelter for men without homes in the entire city of Philadelphia. He arrived carrying a single request that tells you everything about the pride and the pain wound together inside him. He asked the other men in that shelter not to tell anyone who he was. Do not say that a world champion is sleeping among you. Let me be just another man here. And they kept his secret. The other residents,
Men who had their own hard roads and their own lost years looked at this fallen champion and chose to protect him. There was a quiet dignity in that silence, shared among men the world had largely forgotten. And there was a haunting echo in it, too. Once, long ago, a small boy had stood before a policewoman, unable to give his own name because he truly did not have one. Now, that same person sat in a shelter, hiding the famous name he had built with his own bleeding hands. Not because he had lost it, but because he could not yet bear for anyone to know how far he had fallen. But the silence did not last forever. When he was finally ready to tell his story, he gave it to the men beside him. He chose the residents' own street newspaper, One Step Away, as the place to speak. The cover story that followed, titled Fighting Back, was put together by Kevin Roberts and a fellow shelter resident named Jose Espinoza, and it went on to win an international award for the best interview among street newspapers across the world. A support counselor at the shelter captured the meaning of his presence there in one unforgettable line. He gave the men there, the counselor said, men with no hope at all, some hope. Long before the shelter, the sport itself had already made its judgment. In 1998, Matthew Saad Muhammad was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. Whatever the courts had said about his finances, whatever the later years would take, that honor could never be repossessed. The final comeback of his life was not a fight. It was a calling. After his time in the shelter, he did not slip back into the shadows. He became a spokesperson for One Step Away and served as host of its annual fundraiser, named with a fighter's wink, Knock Out Homelessness. The man who had once knocked out the best light heavyweights in the world now lent that same name to a different kind of opponent. The despair he had felt firsthand, the loss of a roof, the loss of dignity, he understood better than any speaker they could have found. He found other purpose, too, working with young fighters out of Atlantic City, passing along the hard wisdom of a body that had given everything to the sport. And through all of it, he carried a single message, distilled from a life that had been knocked down more times than anyone could count. Those who worked beside him remembered the heart of it plainly. You might be down, they recalled him insisting, but you can get back up. It was not a slogan he had read somewhere. It was the literal story of his existence, from the church steps to the world title to the shelter and out again. But even as he was reaching down to pull other men up off the floor, a final opponent had already slipped quietly into the ring with him. In the years near the end, the doctors gave the last opponent a name. He was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the illness many know as Lou Gehrig's disease. It is a thief of the body's strength, slow and merciless, and it does not care how many championship rounds a man once survived. For a fighter whose entire identity had been built on movement and on storming back from punishment, it was perhaps the most unbearable foe imaginable. On the 25th of May, 2014, the fight ended. He passed away at Chestnut Hill Hospital in Philadelphia. He was 59 years old. His funeral was held on the 6th of June at the Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church in the Germantown section of the city. Around 200 mourners came to say goodbye, and among them, having traveled all the way from California, stood Yaqui López, the warrior he had fought twice in two of the most savage battles the sport had ever seen. Two men who had tried with everything in them to destroy each other across 30 rounds of war, and across the decades the distance had turned into something like brotherhood. López came to honor him. There may be no purer tribute in all of boxing than that. The Associated Press remembered him as one of the most exciting fighters of all time and noted what he had become in his final act: an advocate for the homeless, a man who had lived in a shelter himself and refused to let that be the end of his usefulness. And so we return to where we began, to the wide Philadelphia parkway and the nameless child left upon it. He spent his whole life answering the question that policewoman had once asked him: "Who are you?" He answered it in the ring, as a champion who got up off the canvas when no one else could. He answered it in faith, choosing his own name at last. He answered it in ruin, when the money vanished and the trust was betrayed. And he answered it most completely of all in a homeless shelter, when he turned his deepest fall into hope for other broken men. The boy who did not know his own name became a man the world will not forget. And that, in the end, was the greatest comeback he ever made.